Hello and welcome to this webinar about what is evidence-based patient advocacy and how does it help you to advocate for patients. My name is Geissler. I'm a long-standing cancer patient survivor, a CML patient. I'm CEO of Patvocates and the European Patient Advocacy Institute. I'm co-founder of the CML Advocates Network and the Acute Leukemia Advocates Network, as well as WeCan. This webinar is being provided in the Global Advocate Academy course in partnership with the Life Raft Group and Sarcoma Patients Advocacy Global Network. What I'm going to cover today are actually 4 topics. First of all, why should we use evidence in patient advocacy? And then about evidence-based advocacy, what's the concept behind that? Then I'm going to provide some examples, and then I'm going to cover the topic of how to publish data as a patient advocate. So let me just start with why are we advocates? Of course, we want impact for the good of patients. So we support patients on their day-to-day basis. We support their families who are living and dealing with challenging diseases to take the right choices. As patient advocates, we also try to help clinicians to give the best service possible to patients and to prevent also bad and outdated practice. We'd like to influence regulators and payers to make sure they're basing their decisions on patient preferences and needs. And of course, in terms of policy work, we want to tell politicians to do policy for patients, not just about patients. And if we think about what patient organizations and patient advocacy organizations do, they usually operate on 3 levels. So the core of patient engagement, patient advocacy, or patient organizations is, of course, providing peer support. This is where most organizations start because patients that are living with a condition or their families are trying to help their peers, helping them to provide information, to understand disease, to navigate their journey, and so on. So providing patient support is the core thing that many patient organizations do. Others do shape health policy, health and regulatory policy. So they work with parliaments, with policymakers, healthcare institutions, and so on, and are trying to bring in patients' unmet needs and trying to help the political system actually to take the right choices for the best of patients. And then the third areas of activities support research and shape research. Because, of course, patient organizations want to make sure that research really focuses on patients' unmet needs. I'm not saying that every organization covers all 3 levels. Some just do research, like research foundations and research-oriented patient organizations. Some are focused fully around policy and focus their work on the national capital, on the EU, or wherever. And some just do patient support, and some of them do all 3. But it's, of course, important. All have different purposes, different backgrounds in different directions. And that's why evidence on all 3 might have very different contexts. But let's go back and think about what the difficult choices are that patients need to take. Because especially in cancer, usually unattractive choices and trade-offs are often the norm for patients, unfortunately. Because patients, when they're being diagnosed with a serious disease, have to decide sometimes between the bad and the ugly, which are usually the therapeutic options that are open to them, being confronted with a life-threatening disease, or they have to choose the unknown, meaning investigational therapies and trials, which operate in the safe harbor environment, but of course less is known about new drugs, and that's why it might be the unknown. So in the end, they need to take those choices. So what can the research community and institutions actually learn from the patient community? Because what we often hear is, aren't we all patients someday? So I know well what patients need. That's what we often hear from doctors. But in the end, it's not the case. Because you've gone through the shit, you really have to have had that life-changing experience, that transformation, that actually really understand why healthcare counts, but usually health only counts when you don't have it anymore. So patients can provide a lot of insights, and especially patient organizations have a lot of deep insight into what it means to live with a condition and how it affects the person affected and the whole family around that. So they can share a lot of insight into the unmet need and the real value to patients. We're not talking about societal value or economic value or other values. We talk about really what is important to patients. Then, of course, we talk about practical challenges. Patient organizations can talk a lot about breakpoints in the system, where referral doesn't work, where patients can't get the care and management that they need, where they feel lost in the system, where they can't access therapy or diagnostics and so on, or supportive therapies, for example. So patient organizations know a lot way beyond therapies what actually affects the life of patients a lot. They can help on judgments on risk benefit, because sometimes diagnostics or therapies have wanted or unwanted effects, might affect quality of life. And sometimes healthcare systems need to take difficult judgments between access and safety. And patients can, or patient organizations can help to find the right judgment and to understand what risks are patients really willing to take to receive specific benefits. And there might also be subgroups on that in the same community. They also know a lot about issues that patients usually do not discuss with their doctor. For example, the issues around fertility and sexuality have a lot of taboo, and patients don't want to address this to their physician, but they turn up in our support groups, turn up in our Facebook groups, turn up in all kinds of online forums and hotlines and so on, and actually share a lot about that. And that might make a life very different, but the doctors don't hear about that. Then, of course, the patient organizations can actually outline informational gaps that actually hinder informed consent. Also in vulnerable and left behind groups, if we talk about diversity or representativeness. And also they can actually help on shared decision making, that it's really a shared decision between a patient and a doctor on an equal eye level. But is patient know best any better than doctor know best? And sometimes we hammer our head against the wall because we know what's right, we know what's wrong, but in the end, we're not helping, because a healthcare system is really data driven. So in the end, you need evidence to actually convince people. Sometimes it opens doors if you actually have your head against the wall, but it's better if you bring evidence and actually make everyone convinced that it's the right choice. And why is it not enough to ask a doctor? I'm going to provide you with some evidence around that. Because patients often have a unique perspective on side effects, and not always the doctors knows best. And look at these bars. This was a survey that Melanoma Patients Europe did years back in 2009. And you can actually see that the blue bars are physicians and the orange bars are patients. And the question in the longer questionnaire was actually, what's the treatment side effect that has the most negative impact on overall well-being of patients affected by multiple myeloma, which is a blood cancer? And you can see the blue bar, for example, on hair loss. Physicians said, yeah, well, hair loss, while for about almost 50% of patients, this was the most negative impact, because they might not feel well to leave home or to present themselves or to have a social life or whatever. So there might be a lot of impact on their well-being, while of course medically it doesn't count. Or the other dimension, like neuropathy, numbness of the fingers, for example. Typical clinical issue where more than 80% of physicians rated that as a very severe, the most severe impact, while only for about 50%, still a lot, but much less, of patients rated it that way. Or the same about respiratory effects or thrombotic events. There's a very different judgment. So if you think about healthcare decision-making advised by clinicians, or if you think about clinical decision-making, just the focus is different, because of course HCPs, healthcare professionals, focus on the clinical effects and focus less on other factors that might affect life very heavily, but probably not the clinical management of patients. Another mistake that we often do as patient advocates is actually barking up the wrong tree, because you always need to think of who do you want to influence and who's the decision maker. And we sometimes keep complaining here and there, but we're probably addressing it just to the wrong person. If you take, for Europe as an example, we have specific issues, for example, reimbursement that the national member states of the European Union decide. or there are issues that the European Union decides. So, for example, general data protection regulation or the way how clinical trials are being run across Europe. That's the European level. So it doesn't help if we complain to the European Union about reimbursement, or if we complain to the national level about how the clinical trials are being regulated, because the competency for the respective policies on the other level. Same applies if you talk about the doctors. I mean, there's a difference between medical societies, which, for example, run working groups on guidelines or run big conferences, against study groups, which might run collaborative research projects, or individual clinicians, which might have a very specific study. So your advocacy work should think about, if you're trying to target the doctors or the healthcare professionals, which entity actually takes a decision on that or actually has a work group on that. Same applies to industry. If we talk about industry as a whole, single companies take care of single treatments. So they have specific products. So if you want to address an issue about a specific product, you need to talk to the respective company. While there are some things which are more systemic, might be cross-cutting and affecting all of the different pharmaceutical companies. And that's where you need to talk to the industry association like FPL or IFPMA or others that actually bring different competing companies together to work on, for example, a joint policy project. Then there might be disease-specific action, because there might be things that you actually can address in sarcoma or in myeloma or lung cancer. But if you go to parliaments, usually they don't have a sarcoma or lung cancer law. They have, for example, cancer policy, or they have health policy, which means that you might need to do cross-disease joint action with other indication areas, with organizations in other indications, if you want to change the healthcare system. Because usually parliamentarians might not hear or listen to specifically just your disease. And that's why you need to think about what are the things that you need to do very vertically in your disease, and what you need to do more horizontally in alliances with other indication areas. And then, of course, when you think about what other umbrella organizations could do for you, again, think about what they can do best and what their objectives and their mission is, because they all have limits. Everybody's got limits. So you need to think about what is their focus, where do they put their energy on, where do they have staff or volunteers that work on a specific topic. And that's a topic where you can probably win their collaboration or their cooperation on. So taking all that into account, let's talk about the concept of evidence-based advocacy. So evidence-based advocacy is actually the sweet spot between these three things. First of all, targeted advocacy. So barking up the right tree. Think about who you talk to. Thinking about what you want to change. So really being targeted, not just very broad, complaining about an issue, but think about who is actually the decision maker. What do you want from them? Then bring really good data. So data that actually supports your cause, that underlines your arguments, that brings a rationale behind your ask. And then, of course, package it right. If you go to clinicians or to academia, you need to bring a paper, at best peer-reviewed. If you go to politicians, it needs to be a short, crisp, and probably very appealing storyline, because they probably don't want to know the technicalities, but want to understand how it affects citizens. Or if you want to address it to industry, you also need to package it in a way that industry understands the context in which they're developing products. So that's why evidence-based advocacy is advocating in a targeted, evidence-based, well-educated and professional manner, and measure impact and outcomes of what we do. So how does generating evidence work in patient advocacy? Because we might think, well, that's for others. Others need to generate that evidence, but sometimes it's really the patient organizations that need to drive that evidence generation and make sure that evidence actually becomes available for advocacy work. So let's talk about three different types of community-generated evidence, so evidence that actually the patient community can generate. The first area is disease mapping. So mapping out the patient experience living with a specific condition, with a specific therapy in a specific context. Or what the quality of life of patients with a specific indication or disease or condition is. Or what's the burden of disease? How does it affect life? Or what are the unmet patient needs, taking into account all the services and therapies that are available? What is still big gap. And then, of course, adherence. So what is let's say, adherence behavior that patients take medicine or as prescribed, or that they leave out therapy from time to time, intentionally and non-intentionally. So that's data, for example, you can generate, and probably nobody else has it. Then on patient preferences, you can actually find out what patients prefer. Think about the unknown, the bad and the ugly. How do people, for example, trade off survival against quality of life? And the answer to that is often not so black and white as we think. And it might also be different depending on over time, or depending on which subgroup, the young patients, the patient that still plan a family, the patients that want to see their kid finish school, the patients that actually prefer quality of life for a couple of years. So there might be different priorities, and we need to know and have evidence around that. And then the final category is inequalities mapping, where you actually unveil differences. For example, where are the worst outcomes in an indication area? Where is lowest access to diagnostics or treatment? Or which vulnerable groups are left behind in our community? So that's inequality mapping. Now I'm going to provide you some examples now that you can imagine what, for example, community-based evidence could be in those areas. So these are different examples from the community. I'm going to go into those because this is not theory. This is lived practice by many patient organizations. So examples. First of all, disease mapping. I'd like to highlight, for example, the Acute Leukemia Advocates Network. Acute leukemias are very severe conditions. Usually there's probably about 48 hours between diagnosis and hospitalization. It's very, very quickly a very life-threatening disease. You need to start therapy actually immediately. There's not much time for, let's say, thinking about options and shared decision-making. You need to get going. However, even though a lot of patients, unfortunately, still today pass away from acute leukemias, for those that make it, the question is, what's the quality of life of those that actually survive? And there is very little data about that because the whole research system is actually focused around keeping people alive, about survival and optimizing survival. But there's very little data about how they feel and how they function if they get through that. And so that's why the Acute Leukemia Advocates Network actually ran a global quality of life survey in over 10 languages to identify factors associated with quality of life differences in acute leukemia, and actually to understand what is ahead of patients usually getting through acute leukemias, and also give suggestions how to improve quality of life in the situation that they are. And that data has been published in conferences like EHA and ASH, in scientific peer-reviewed journals, and also on the internet. And it's heavily used by the community to actually advocate for more attention to quality of life of those that survive acute leukemia. Then another example was adherence, patients not taking their medicines. And for example, in chronic myeloid leukemia, the connection between taking the therapy as prescribed and getting into remission and staying there is very obvious. However, and the clinicians thought and always said, yes, of course, this is cancer. My patients are taking their medicines. But we in the patient community actually knew that this was not the case. So we had these arguments, and finally we said, okay, we need to generate evidence. And that's why we ran a survey run by the CML Advocates Network, which is a network of patient organizations on all continents. And we recruited 2,500 patients from 63 countries within 3 months with a survey that had more than 60 questions. We translated that into 12 languages. In that, we used a validated adherence measurement to actually not be criticized about the lack of robust methodology. And we could actually see there's a big issue. So we saw that more than 20%, so more than every fifth patient was highly unadherent to treatment, either intentionally, so they left out therapy, or unintentionally because they forgot. Only 1/3 of patients were highly adherent. And that was a strong argument. When we presented that data, actually, there was a lot of interest because nobody expected that in a disease where the correlation between adherence and survival was so clear. And one thing that was interesting when we presented this at a medical conference was this chart. You can see on the vertical the missed doses on purpose in last year. On the horizontal, you missed the doses missed accidentally during the year. And you could see we mapped out the countries where we done the survey. And for example, one country, Australia, wasn't doing so well on that. So we were contacted by one of the clinicians at that meeting and said, well, there must be something wrong with your data from Australia because we know the patients and they're very adherent. And we said, well, let's look into our data. And so we made a sub-analysis just for Australia. And I think the conversation changed afterwards because we saw that there is an issue and there are several reasons which has connection to very specific side effects that patients were leaving out therapy. And that actually allowed us to talk about interventions. So how could we support patients specifically with those side effects because they were at highest risk of not taking their medicine as prescribed. So let's go one step back, the essential trial of patient experience data. And this is super important for the patient community because in the end, if you want to prove that quality of life and toxicity has a huge impact on patients and that survival is not the only dimension we should be looking at, there are actually three factors that you need to look at and actually generate evidence on. First one in clinical trials is about reported toxicity, which measures the frequency, severity, accumulation, and transience, which means how often does it appear, how heavy are the side effects, do they accumulate, so are they getting more over time, or they go away, so transience, and so on. And these factors are super important. Sometimes in studies, they just measure, severity and incidence of side effects. So it says 21% had a grade 3 and 12% had a grade 2, whatever, diarrhea and so on. But it doesn't tell you a lot about whether this is just on the onset of new treatment or whether you suffer from that all lifelong. So patients might actually have a very different perspective. But it's super important that it's not just clinician-reported toxicity, but also patient-reported toxicity. There are measures for that. Secondly, patient-reported outcomes. This is, for example, measuring quality of life or impact on activities of daily living. So this actually tells you, how is my quality of life affected? And so you can actually tell what does toxicity to your overall quality of life in different dimensions, like, for example, anxiety and fear or physical ability to do things and so on. And then patient preferences. So patient preferences tell you, remember about the trade-off, the unknown, the bad and the ugly, what patients really value in terms of improvement or what they fear in terms of getting worse. So if you take that essential triangle, you actually need to understand toxicity, you need to understand how toxicity affects quality of life. And in what areas patients would value and appreciate an improvement in quality of life, and would that trade off probably against other areas where there might be worsening of quality of life, but probably it's not as bad as the improvement in the other area. So that's why this triangle is so important, but usually that data is not being generated. That's why the patient community really needs to drive the generation of that evidence. So some more examples on inequalities, for example. So, for example, there might be data on differences like worst outcomes, lowest access to diagnostics and treatment, or vulnerable groups. So there's a lot of data you can actually generate. And for example, Myeloma Patients Europe has generated a lot of data about the inequalities of access to specific combination treatments across Europe. Of course, seeing the West-East divide that we actually have in Europe. On access to therapies. And they collected evidence from healthcare systems, from pharmaceutical industry, from the patient organizations, and brought that into a visual tool to actually understand how different access is across Europe, and are using that on the national level and also European level to actually lobby for change. And finally, in health policy, I'm going to bring one example that I was involved in when the European legislation for clinical trials across Europe was being revised. The former directive that was effective in the early 2000s was actually quite a monster in terms of bureaucracy. You can see actually the reporting lines down there in this chart, who was actually reporting safety reports to whom. You see the different institutions on the left. You see actually those that actually should take care. And you see the different types in yellow of serious adverse events. And actually, there was a lot of reporting, a lot of paper being done, but in the end, in that noise, the real sickness got lost. And that's the data that we actually brought. So I went to, when I was involved in that process, I actually went to the study groups and said, so how many pages do you need to copy to provide them to authorities to run a multi-center study? And how does this reporting work? And we took that data actually to the consultation groups when consultations were being done on the legal framework, on the upcoming drafts of the new legislation. And we heard from the European Commission that this really made a difference. It made a huge difference to assess, not to overstretch reporting and, let's say, misunderstand quantity against quality of reporting. So that was really an effective thing. And this is what I mentioned earlier on there. We and Myeloma Patients Europe and others have collected a lot of data about where trials are being run. And you can actually see in these charts on the left side, it's the GAAC project. On the right side, it's the Myeloma Patients Europe Trial Navigator. You can see how many trials are run in which European country, and you can clearly see here the East-West inequalities and on where trials are being run. So finally, just some reflections on methodology. It's super important just to think about how you deal with evidence and how to use that. What is super important is that you should not generate evidence just to back up your opinion or your existing point of view. Evidence is actually to understand what it is. And if evidence contradicts to what you thought, it's important that you listen to the evidence and act on it. Because sometimes we fall into the trap as patient advocates because we ourselves are living with a condition. We have specific topics that really bother us, that we actually overestimate the things that bother us personally and underestimate other issues of other patients in our community. And that's why it's super important. The evidence should not only inform others, but should also help us to take the right directions in advocacy. So that's super important. Listen to the evidence, not just to confirm your opinion, but because it informs you whether you're on the right track or whether probably there's a heterogeneity in opinion in your own community. So finally, publish or perish. That's a saying that is super important for evidence generation, because if you have amazing data, but you have it on your hard disk, you present it at a conference, and then it disappears, you might no longer be in the organization or other people that have generated the evidence, and everybody might forget about it. So it's super important the data is being published properly. The data, for example, I've shown early on with the difference between healthcare professionals and patients at the bars. This was a survey run back in 2009, but the data was just put on the website and it disappeared on a website revamp. And because it never appeared in a peer-reviewed journal, it's very hard to quote it today because the data is no longer available, except for people like me that have it on their hard disk. So that's why it's super important to publish the data and plan the time for it. And of course, we're not scientists as patient advocates, so you need to understand a bit about the publication process. And there's a solution for that, because WeCan has developed an open access training course for patient advocates with 4 modules, which tells you the whole thing about how to plan a publication, how to write a publication and work with medical writers and those that can help you on that, and how to select journals and how to deal with peer reviewers and so on. And about open access and all these things. So I can highly recommend, if you're interested, or if you're in the middle of generating data and you want to understand how do I bring that data later on in a journal and how do I deal with this whole process, this course explains it in patient terms for patient advocates. So with that, I'd like to end my presentation, and I do hope that when you felt like trial and error on generating evidence, like you can see on the left chart, that we've moved more to the right side, that you understand that generating evidence and using it is not so difficult. And sometimes generating solid evidence often starts only with a simple survey. It doesn't need to be complex, but it's important that you have a plan, that you do it, and that you get the data out, that it's being used widely. Thank you so much for your attention. And if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.